7 triggers that make an avoidant break his silence and contact you. Imagine for a moment that the message you've been waiting for is already written. Not sent, not deleted, just sitting somewhere between fear and longing. Because one of the biggest misconceptions people have about avoidance is believing that silence means certainty. That if they have gone quiet, disappeared, withdrawn, or stopped reaching out, then they must have fully moved on. But what if the silence isn't a conclusion? What if it's a conflict? What if the very thing that looks like emotional distance on the outside is actually emotional overload on the inside? That's what makes avoidant behavior so confusing. The louder their feelings become, the quieter they often get. The stronger the attachment feels, the more they may convince themselves they need space. And for the person left behind, that silence can feel endless. It can feel personal, it can feel like proof that you never mattered. But the reality is often far more complicated than that. In this video, we're diving deep into the 7 triggers that can make an avoidant break his silence and finally contact you again. Some of these triggers are surprising, some are uncomfortable, and a few might completely change the way you understand what has really been happening during the silence. And if you've ever found yourself replaying old conversations, wondering what happened, trying to understand the psychology behind the distance, make sure you're subscribed because this channel is dedicated to helping you understand the hidden emotional patterns that most people never talk about. Now, let's begin with something that almost nobody expects. The strange thing about avoidance is that they often notice your silence long before they react to it. At first, when communication stops, they may appear completely unaffected. They continue their routines. They immerse themselves in work, hobbies, distractions, responsibilities, and all the things that help them maintain a sense of independence. From the outside, it can look as though they've forgotten about you entirely, but then something unexpected happens. The pattern changes. For weeks or months, they may have grown accustomed to your messages, your attempts to reconnect, your emotional availability, or simply the comfort of knowing you were still there. Even if they rarely acknowledged it, that certainty existed in the background, then one day they notice it's gone. No message, no reaction, no pursuit, no emotional pressure, just silence, real silence. And that silence often lands differently than people imagine. Because when an avoidant no longer feels chased, something shifts. The emotional landscape becomes unfamiliar. Questions begin to emerge where certainty once existed. They start wondering what changed. They start noticing your absence in ways they couldn't while they were focused on creating distance. Ironically, the moment you stop trying to close the gap is often the moment they finally become aware of how wide that gap has become. To understand why this happens, you first have to understand what silence feels like inside the avoidant mind. Most people assume that withdrawal is a deliberate strategy. They think avoidants distance themselves because they don't care. But in many cases, avoidance isn't about a lack of emotion. It's about discomfort with emotion. When relationships become emotionally intense, avoidants often experience an internal conflict that is difficult to explain. One part of them wants connection, intimacy, and closeness just like anyone else. Another part fears dependence, vulnerability, and the possibility of being emotionally overwhelmed. These two forces pull against each other constantly. As a result, silence becomes a coping mechanism. It creates temporary relief from emotional pressure. It gives them room to regain a sense of control. But what many people fail to realize is that emotional needs don't disappear simply because they're ignored. They wait, they linger, they remain active beneath the surface. During no contact, an avoidant may not be expressing their feelings, but that doesn't mean those feelings have vanished. In fact, the absence of interaction often creates more space for reflection than constant communication ever could. The silence that protects them can eventually become the silence that forces them to confront what they've been avoiding. This brings us to the first major trigger that can make an avoidant break his silence: the realization that you're no longer chasing him. For many avoidants, pursuit becomes part of the relationship dynamic. Not because they consciously seek it out, but because it reinforces a sense of emotional safety. As long as they know you're there, as long as they believe you haven't truly left, they can maintain distance without fully facing the consequences of that distance. But when your pursuit genuinely stops, the emotional equation changes. Suddenly, they can no longer assume they have unlimited access to your attention. They can no longer rely on the idea that you'll always be waiting, and that realization can create a powerful psychological response. Human beings naturally value what feels uncertain. We notice what is no longer guaranteed. We become curious about what seems to be slipping away. For an avoidant, this uncertainty can become impossible to ignore, not because they're playing games, not because they're manipulating the situation, but because the emotional safety net they unconsciously relied upon is no longer there. And when that happens, silence begins to feel very different. The reason this trigger is so powerful comes down to the role uncertainty plays in human psychology. Most avoidants are incredibly comfortable when they understand the emotional landscape around them. They may resist closeness, but they often feel reassured knowing exactly where they stand with someone. Predictability creates a sense of control. It reduces emotional risk. But when you stop chasing, predictability disappears. Suddenly, they don't know what you're thinking. They don't know how you feel. They don't know whether you've moved on, found happiness elsewhere, or reached a point where returning is no longer possible. That uncertainty creates tension, and tension creates attention. This doesn't mean every avoidant will immediately send a message. It doesn't mean silence guarantees contact, but it does mean something important has changed. The emotional spotlight that was once focused on them begins to shift away, and when they notice that shift, they often find themselves thinking about you more, not less. They replay memories, they revisit conversations, they wonder whether the connection they stepped away from is still available. In many cases, this is the first crack in the wall of silence. It's the moment when distance stops feeling comfortable and starts feeling consequential. And as you'll soon discover, this is only the beginning of the deeper triggers that can pull an avoidant out of silence and back into contact. Another trigger that can quietly disrupt an avoidant's silence is seeing you move forward without them. This is often misunderstood as jealousy, but it runs deeper than that. Avoidants frequently maintain emotional distance by assuming the connection remains available in the background. Even when they withdraw, part of them may still believe the relationship is emotionally paused rather than truly changing. Then they notice something different. You begin investing in your own life. You reconnect with friends, pursue goals, develop new routines, travel, laugh again, or simply carry yourself with a kind of grounded calm they haven't seen before. You're no longer orbiting the silence. You're no longer communicating your pain indirectly through posts, late-night messages, or visible emotional exhaustion. And that shift can hit an avoidant harder than direct confrontation ever could. Because growth creates contrast. It forces them to see the relationship from a new angle. The version of you they expected to remain emotionally available has evolved. Your energy feels less accessible, less centered around them, and more connected to your own life. That can awaken curiosity, longing, and even regret. Not because you're trying to provoke them, but because genuine forward movement changes the emotional dynamic completely. What makes this trigger especially powerful is that avoidants are often highly sensitive to emotional pressure, but unexpectedly responsive to emotional freedom. When someone is intensely focused on reconnecting, they may interpret that as demand, expectation, or loss of autonomy. But when that same person becomes emotionally self-directed, the atmosphere changes. The connection no longer feels like an obligation. It begins to feel like a choice, and choices feel safer to avoidance than pressure. This is why many people are shocked when contact suddenly appears after they finally stopped waiting obsessively. The irony is painful but real. The moment you become less emotionally dependent on the outcome is often the moment they become more emotionally aware of what they lost. That doesn't mean you should perform independence as a strategy. Avoidants can often sense the difference between authentic growth and calculated detachment. Real growth is quieter. It isn't trying to be seen. It changes your posture, your priorities, your emotional availability to yourself. And that authenticity is what makes the shift so difficult for them to ignore. A third trigger emerges during significant emotional events in their life. Avoidants are known for compartmentalizing emotions, but major life stress can overwhelm those compartments. A career setback, family crisis, health scare, loss, relocation, or even a profound moment of loneliness can disrupt the emotional defenses they usually rely on. During these periods, the illusion of complete self-sufficiency starts to crack. They may find themselves craving familiarity, comfort, or emotional grounding even if they normally avoid depending on others. This is when old connections can resurface with surprising intensity. Memories become more vivid. Your emotional presence in their life feels more meaningful. The relationship they once distanced themselves from may suddenly represent safety rather than pressure. It's important to understand that this doesn't necessarily mean they've transformed overnight. Stress can temporarily lower defenses and increase attachment-seeking behavior. But it does reveal something important. Beneath the avoidance, there was an emotional bond that never fully disappeared. Difficult times have a way of changing how the brain processes memory. When people feel unstable or emotionally exposed, they often gravitate toward familiar emotional experiences. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of attachment activation. The mind searches for places, people, and memories associated with comfort, connection, and regulation. For avoidance, this can be disorienting. They may have spent months convincing themselves they needed distance, only to suddenly find themselves thinking about you constantly during a crisis. A song reminds them of a specific moment together. A stressful night makes them remember how calm they felt with you. A personal setback makes them miss the version of themselves that existed in the relationship. Nostalgia becomes emotionally charged, not just sentimental. And because avoidants often suppress feelings until they become impossible to ignore, these moments can feel unexpectedly intense. The silence that once felt protective starts to feel isolating. Reaching out becomes less about strategy and more about seeking connection they thought they no longer needed. The fourth trigger develops more slowly, but it can be one of the most decisive. Positive memories begin outweighing negative ones. Right after distance or conflict, avoidants often focus on what felt overwhelming, restrictive, or emotionally demanding in the relationship. This helps justify the withdrawal and reduces internal conflict. But human memory is not static. Over time, emotional intensity fades, arguments lose their sharpness, frustrations become less vivid. Meanwhile, moments of warmth, intimacy, humor, support, and genuine connection start resurfacing more clearly. Psychologists call this the fading affect bias, the tendency for negative emotions attached to memories to fade faster than positive ones. For avoidants, this can create a gradual emotional reversal. The relationship that once felt heavy begins to feel meaningful again. They start remembering not just the pressure they escaped, but the comfort they abandoned. The laughter, the understanding, the sense of being known. And because avoidants often disconnect from feelings in the moment, they may process the value of a relationship long after it ends. This is where an intense internal battle often begins. On one side is pride, fear, and the desire to maintain emotional control. On the other is longing, curiosity, and the growing awareness that the connection mattered more than they admitted. Avoidants frequently hesitate to reach out because contact feels risky. What if you reject them? What if reconnecting pulls them back into emotions they don't know how to handle? What if vulnerability costs them the sense of independence they've been protecting? These fears can delay action for weeks or months, but the emotional pressure doesn't disappear. It accumulates quietly. They may check your social media, ask mutual friends about you, revisit old conversations, or mentally rehearse what they would say if they contacted you. From the outside, none of this is visible. The silence remains intact. But internally, the distance is no longer emotionally settled. The more positive memories rise to the surface, the harder it becomes to maintain the narrative that leaving solved everything. And for many avoidants, that is the moment the wall of silence starts to crack for real. And yet, one of the most powerful triggers isn't something the avoidant experiences internally at first, it's something they sense in you. Trigger number 5 happens when they begin to realize that you are truly letting go, not pretending to let go. Not posting carefully crafted messages designed to get their attention, not disappearing as a tactic, actually letting go. There is a profound difference between someone who is waiting while acting detached and someone who has genuinely accepted that life will continue regardless of whether contact ever happens again. Avoidants are often more perceptive than people realize. They may miss obvious emotional conversations, but they frequently notice shifts in energy, patterns, and expectations. When someone truly releases the need for a specific outcome, their behavior changes naturally. They stop checking constantly. They stop trying to decode every sign. Their emotional world becomes larger than the relationship. And that shift can be deeply unsettling for an avoidant because it removes the invisible tether they assumed was still connecting the two of you. Suddenly they are faced with a reality they may have avoided considering. You may actually be moving beyond them, not in anger, not in bitterness, simply in acceptance. And acceptance can sometimes create more emotional impact than confrontation ever could. Part of the reason this trigger is so effective is because genuine detachment changes the emotional atmosphere surrounding the connection. For a long time, the avoidant may have associated the relationship with pressure, expectation, or unresolved tension. Even if those perceptions weren't entirely accurate, they shaped the emotional experience. But when you stop carrying those expectations, something unexpected happens. The emotional weight surrounding the relationship becomes lighter. From a distance, you no longer represent demands or difficult conversations. Instead, you become associated with freedom, maturity, and emotional stability. Ironically, the very qualities that felt threatening during periods of closeness can begin to feel attractive once enough space exists. This doesn't mean you should detach in hopes of creating a reaction. True detachment cannot be performed successfully because it isn't a behavior, it's an emotional state, and when it's real, it often radiates in ways that don't require explanation. Avoidants frequently respond to that authenticity because it feels safer than emotional pursuit. The relationship begins to exist in their mind without the pressure they once associated with it, allowing curiosity and longing to emerge where resistance previously lived. Then comes trigger number 6, one of the most unpredictable forces in the entire process, a reminder. It sounds simple, almost insignificant, but human beings are deeply shaped by emotional associations. A particular song, a familiar street, a restaurant, a season, a holiday, a photograph, a scent carried unexpectedly on the wind, a casual comment from a mutual friend. These moments can unlock emotions that seem dormant for months. The avoidant may be moving through an ordinary day when something suddenly pulls a memory to the surface with remarkable clarity. Not just a thought, but a feeling. The emotional texture of a moment returns. The comfort of a conversation, the excitement of anticipation, the safety of being understood. And because avoidants often keep emotions compartmentalized, these reminders can arrive with surprising force. They bypass intellectual defenses. They reach places logic cannot. In an instant, the distance that felt manageable can begin to feel painfully real. What makes these reminders so powerful is that meaningful relationships leave lasting imprints on the brain. We often imagine memories as static recordings, but emotional memories function differently. They remain connected to feelings, sensations, and neural pathways that can reactivate years later. The stronger the emotional significance of the relationship, the deeper those pathways tend to be. This is why people can suddenly think about someone they haven't spoken to in months after hearing a single song or visiting a familiar location. For avoidants, these experiences can be particularly impactful because they spend so much energy minimizing emotional awareness. A reminder can temporarily dissolve that emotional distance. It can force them to feel the connection rather than analyze it. And once a feeling has been reactivated, it often continues echoing long after the initial trigger disappears. They may find themselves revisiting memories repeatedly, wondering what you're doing, questioning decisions they once felt confident about, or imagining conversations that never happened. The silence becomes harder to maintain because the emotional reality underneath it has been brought back into focus. But perhaps the deepest trigger of all is trigger number 7, emotional maturity. Unlike the other triggers, this one doesn't depend on circumstances, nostalgia, or temporary vulnerability. It emerges from growth, real growth. The kind that often comes through difficult experiences, painful lessons, self-reflection, therapy, loss, failure, or simply the passage of time. One of the defining characteristics of avoidance is the tendency to prioritize emotional protection over emotional connection. But life has a way of challenging protective strategies. Over time, some avoidants begin noticing patterns in their relationships. They see opportunities lost because they pulled away too soon. They recognize loneliness hidden beneath independence. They start understanding that vulnerability, while uncomfortable, is not the same thing as danger. This realization rarely happens overnight. It develops gradually, often through experiences that force them to confront parts of themselves they once ignored. And when that shift occurs, their perspective on past relationships can change dramatically. An avoidant who has reached a new level of emotional maturity often begins revisiting old connections with different eyes. The relationship is no longer evaluated solely through the lens of discomfort or fear. They start seeing the value they overlooked. They recognize moments when they withdrew instead of communicating. They understand the impact their silence may have had. Most importantly, they become more capable of tolerating the vulnerability required for reconnection. This doesn't guarantee they will reach out. Growth is rarely linear, and fear doesn't disappear completely. But the internal barriers that once felt insurmountable become less rigid. The possibility of contact begins to feel less threatening and more meaningful. They no longer see reaching out as surrendering control. They begin seeing it as an act of courage, and that is where everything starts to converge. The uncertainty created by your absence, the sight of your growth, the emotional weight of difficult life experiences, the gradual rise of positive memories, the realization that you're truly moving forward, the reminders that bring old feelings rushing back, and finally the maturity that allows them to face those feelings honestly. Each trigger alone may not be enough, but together they create pressure beneath the silence, a quiet accumulation of thoughts, emotions, memories, and realizations. The kind that eventually makes an avoidant pick up the phone, open the message box, stare at the screen, and begin considering something they once worked very hard to avoid, reaching out. But before that message is ever sent, before the silence is finally broken, there is often a phase that almost nobody sees. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. Days pass, weeks pass, sometimes months pass. Yet internally, an avoidant may be moving through a process that is far more active than their silence suggests. This is what usually happens right before they finally contact you. They start paying attention again, not necessarily in obvious ways, but in subtle ones. They may revisit old conversations. They may check your social media more often than they admit. They may ask mutual acquaintances about you without revealing why. They may notice details they previously ignored. The reason is simple. Before avoidants risk direct contact, they often search for emotional safety. Reaching out requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is precisely what they have spent so much time trying to manage.